Welcome back to the Diabetes Podcast, where we bring you the latest evidence-based strategies to help you take control of your health, reverse insulin resistance, and achieve type 2 diabetes remission. Today, we're continuing on with DeFronzo's Dirty Dozen core defects of type 2 diabetes by wrapping up with the last of the initial 8 core defects identified. These were known as the catchy, ominous octet, the last of which is alpha cell dysfunction, or in simpler terms, glucagon gone rogue. If you've ever wondered why blood sugar rises even when you haven't eaten, or why it is that you can go to sleep with a blood sugar that is lower than the one you wake up with, even though you didn't wake up to eat anything during the night, this episode is for you. We're going to explore what alpha cells do, what goes wrong in type 2 diabetes, how medications work at the level of alpha cell defect, and how nutrition and movement can bring this dysfunctional system back into alignment. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Diabetes Podcast. I'm Richie.
And I'm Amber.
And Amber, today we're talking about alpha cell dysfunction. I think previously we talked about beta cell dysfunction, and previously we also talked about how both the alpha cells and the beta cells are in our pancreas. But could you get us up to speed on what alpha cells do in a healthy pancreas?
Yes. Alpha cells are critical in regulating blood sugar in your body, or you could say glucose homeostasis. So our body really likes to be at a set point for different things, and that's the word homeostasis. It just has certain levels of calcium that it likes in the blood, certain glucose levels it likes in the blood as well. So it's really critical in regulating that. And as you said, the alpha cells are in the pancreas. And those alpha cells secrete glucagon, which is a hormone, and that hormone signals the liver to release stored glucose. And another name for stored glucose is glycogen. So you can store glycogen in your liver and muscle cells, but this signals specifically to the liver to release stored glucose. And it's especially important during fasting, during exercise, or during a low blood sugar event, or to regulate and keep blood sugar from going low in people who don't have type 1 diabetes. So basically it's a counterbalance, like a seesaw effect, with glucagon on one side and insulin on the other, counterbalancing each other to maintain glucose homeostasis, or to regulate glucose. The glucagon is suppressed by insulin and glucose. So after you eat, and the insulin rises, glucagon falls to tell the liver to stop pumping out glucose. You don't need glucose if you're currently digesting it in your system. That is regulated very tightly.
All right. So tell us what happens when alpha cells start to dysfunction. What goes wrong?
In type 2 diabetes, alpha cells can become resistant to the normal suppressive effects of glucose and insulin. Remember, we said that glucose and insulin are what suppresses glucagon, and just as insulin resistance is at work with those two things, it's also resistant to glucagon in this stage too. So instead of the normal dialing down of glucagon after a meal, glucagon continues to be secreted instead. So the liver just doesn't get that signaling, and it continues to make new glucose and continues to keep releasing glucose even when the blood sugar is high.
So if I understand correctly, so I'm already insulin resistant. So I've got a bunch of insulin in my system. I have high levels of glucose. And now on top of that, my alpha cells are signaling my liver to dump even more glucose into my bloodstream, really jumping on the dog pile. Is that correct?
Yes. So you got some dogs in a fight and even more jump in, and it's complete chaos. And it's just this major contributor to elevated fasting. So you haven't eaten in a while, that's fasting blood sugar. So it contributes to those being high, and also after meal blood sugars being high. So it's really wild that this is happening even when insulin levels are high.
Right.
Usually insulin suppresses glucagon, but even when the insulin levels are high, this is still going on. The glucagon is still high. And it's like your pancreas is pressing both the gas and the brake at the same time, which really confuses the liver and perpetuates the problem. You ever been in a car or a vehicle with someone who is like gas, brake, gas, brake, gas, brake?
Not someone that's been driving for a bit, but yeah, I think that's the first time driver experience is the stop and go. Yeah.
It's really bad. I went to a concert one time with someone who drove that way, and I never went anywhere with that person driving ever again. It was not a fun experience.
So I know we talked timeline of stuff. The insulin resistance is first, and then elevated glucose levels come later. I'm guessing this is coming after the elevated glucose levels?
It depends on where you're talking about the glucose levels being elevated. And studies show that individuals with impaired glucose tolerance, so that means you've introduced a meal containing carbohydrate and you have elevated blood sugars post-meal. So you have blunted suppression of glucagon. So insulin's supposed to be released, which suppresses glucagon, but you've got some blunting of that suppression after meals. And then you've got a mild elevation of fasting glucagon. So the stage is first you have normal blood sugars with insulin resistance showing up. You've got insulin resistance at the muscle, liver, and fat cells, but the glucose levels look normal. And that's why we spoke in earlier podcasts about getting a fasting insulin lab and kind of seeing where you are with that. Stage 2 would be sort of this compensated high insulin levels where the pancreas is increasing insulin production to maintain normal glucose. And so the glucose levels are still normal because you've got that ramp up in insulin production. And then you've got impaired glucose tolerance. And this is where the beginnings of this alpha cell dysfunction come in. And you start to see these post-meal glucose rises there. So the insulin levels are still high, and you're starting to see post-meal blood sugar spikes. And then as this progresses into the impaired fasting glucose stage, that's really where you start to see the alpha cell dysfunction because the liver is overproducing glucose and the fasting levels are starting to show up as high. And then the diagnosable type 2 diabetes, where your fastings are above or at or above 126 or over 200 anytime blood sugars with symptoms like polydipsia, polyuria, or excessive thirst, excessive hunger, all of that.
So it sounds to me like by the time I get to alpha cell dysfunction, I have multiple systems in my body like deliberately trying to raise my blood sugar at the same time. Is that accurate?
I would say even more accurately that you have multiple systems in your body trying to keep glucose homeostasis, like multiple systems trying to keep the blood sugar levels stable, but for different reasons associated with insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, it's just unable to do that at some point. And that's where you have this diagnosable type 2 diabetes and prediabetes even before that.
I know we've talked about insulin resistance occurring well before a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. The alpha cell dysfunction, is it many years before as well, or is it kind of later stage prior to diagnosis? Is it after diagnosis? When kind of in that timeline is this occurring?
Yeah, it's definitely before diagnosis.
Okay.
So you can have damage to the nervous system 6 years prior to diagnosis or more. You can have a lot of things 10 to 20 years before diagnosis. So I'm not as familiar with like what year this falls into before it. But whenever you start to get the post-meal blood sugars as being high, that's when you could expect that there is some beginnings of alpha cell dysfunction at that timeline.
So let me revise the question. If I have been diagnosed with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, is it safe to say that not only do I have alpha cell dysfunction, but that my liver is almost actively not helping me to keep my blood sugars regulated at this point in time? I have an entire organ that is just dumping sugar inappropriately when I'm trying to bring it down. Is that
absolutely sabotage?
All right.
And not the first time we've seen some mechanisms that are supposed to be helping completely sabotaging.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Are there medications that help with alpha cell dysfunction?
There are, namely your GLP-1 receptor agonists. That would be your Ozempic, Mounjaro, Trulicity. And then at heftier doses indicated for weight loss would be Zepbound and Wegovy. And the reason these work is that they work on multiple defects, and one of them would be suppressing glucagon secretion. And what's really helpful about this is that it's in a glucose-dependent manner. So if the blood sugars are going low, like into the hypoglycemic range, this would not happen. It would not suppress glucagon secretion because glucagon is needed to help prevent low blood sugars. But if the sugars are high, it's going to suppress glucagon to keep the liver from putting out more glucose when your body doesn't need it. And again, any medication is going to come with side effects. So your GLP-1 receptor agonists have mostly nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea as their biggest ones, and definitely not for a personal or family history of medullary thyroid C-cell carcinomas.
Okay. What was that thing that you last said? Because
say that 10 times those fast. Words. Medullary thyroid C-cell tumor. So it's quite rare. However, if you have this, you would know that there's a family history there, and it would be contraindicated for those people.
Okay. And I'm assuming your physician would know this as well, right?
Maybe.
Okay.
And your SGLT2s could potentially help. There are some studies that suggest that SGLT2s could be increasing glucagon levels. And then there's also some rat studies that say maybe they don't. So SGLT2s may help here, not entirely conclusive evidence there. But then also your DPP-4 inhibitors like Januvia, because and these are better used in the early stage of disease, but any DPP-4s kind of work on like the other end of your GLP-1 receptor agonist. GLP-1s work in the gut, and DPP-4 inhibits GLP-1. So this DPP-4 medication works on what is inhibiting GLP-1s. So it prevents the breakdown of GLP-1, indirectly reducing glucagon after meals. So you would not be on a GLP-1 receptor agonist and a DPP-4 inhibitor because they work on the same pathway, just in different ways.
Okay.
And these are very safe. They're just not as effective in later stage disease.
All right. So once again, we've talked about what the meds can do. Is there anything that I can do better than the medication to help me get control of this alpha cell dysfunction?
Yes, we can focus on fiber-rich, minimally processed carbohydrate foods.
Okay.
That would be your beans, lentils, non-starchy veggies. So I always say the non-starchy veggies are sort of everything but your beans, peas, corn, potatoes. So the broccolis and cauliflower and bell peppers and onions of the world. And it's always so interesting to me when I mention that to people, they're like, ew, I hate onions. And it's like, well, there's a ton of non-starchy veggies that are not onions that you can choose from. It's like, don't focus on, let's focus on what you can eat and do eat instead of what you don't eat.
So I got a question, and this may be going a little bit off topic, but take the onions, for example.
Mm-hmm.
When I cook down the onions, they taste wildly different than uncooked onions. Does that negate the effect that the onions are having in my diet? Like, does the cooking of the food, is that what you would consider processing because it is kind of breaking down a little bit and releasing some of those, the onions actually get sweeter? Is that causing it to be a less favorable thing to put in my mouth from a glycemic index standpoint? Does that change the vegetable?
That's a great question. And it depends on the vegetable itself. Some vegetables are better consumed raw, and some vegetables are better consumed cooked, because some of them require cooking to have your body have better access to the nutrition in that veggie. So it's different than processing per se. And processing isn't necessarily bad in and of itself. Canning is a process, and canning is essential to a healthy diet in many aspects, especially if you're being careful to monitor your salt intake. You can still have canned foods that don't have as much salt.
Cooking's not that big a deal is kind of what I'm hearing. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, it's sort of splitting hairs. I think that as your evolution in your nutrition and trying to improve quality in your diet, you could start to look at, okay, I'm having broccoli. Is this better cooked or is this better raw? But the truth is, if you're only going to eat broccoli cooked, it really doesn't matter which one is better. The better way is the one that you're going to do. The better way is the one that you're going to
broccoli.
eat. Yeah, exactly. So back to the focus on fiber-rich foods, your intact whole grains. So when I say intact whole grains, I mean the grain not stripped of the bran and the wheat germ. So not white flour, but rather whole wheat flour. So the number one ingredient, if you're having bread, for example, should be whole grain bread or whole wheat flour. Sorry, not bread. It's going to be the flour. You need the flour to make the bread. So you're going to look for that whole intact grain. And the reason is that these are digested more slowly and help keep the after meal glucose and the insulin levels more stable.
Would oats fall up under intact whole grains?
Yes, and especially your steel cut oats and the slow cooking, as opposed to your Quaker instant, because those have been somewhat stripped. So it depends.
Okay.
And you're going to pair your carbs with protein and healthy fats to further slow digestion. And this can also improve hormonal balance and limit refined grains and added sugars. So mostly I like to focus on like what you can do and not what to not do, what to not do, but absolutely limiting refined grains. That's your white flours, your added sugars to drinks and yogurts and things like that. These can trigger sharp glucose spikes and worsen the mismatch between insulin and glucagon that's already in existence. And exercise, everything we've discussed thus far to reduce insulin resistance through movement is including moderate to intense aerobic activity. So that everything we've said thus far still holds true in the alpha cell dysfunction. So moderate to intense aerobic activity is going to improve liver insulin sensitivity, and it's going to help the liver respond more appropriately to the signaling, because insulin and glucagon, these are both hormones, and that hormone signaling can very much be affected by visceral fat, or the fat that you store around your internal organs.
I think it's worth kind of spelling out here. This is really the first time that we've talked about intense aerobic activity. So up to this date, we've been talking about doing some walking after a meal, again.
Which is the other one, frequent daily movement and walking after a
walking
meal.
Being kind of the big skill to master, to integrate into your daily routine. But when we're talking intense aerobic activity, like this is I won't say no pain, no gain. This is hard work.
It can be.
Now we're starting to get into the HIIT, the high intensity interval training, or the SIT, the sprint interval training. And this is probably something that you want to integrate slowly into your behaviors. This is not I just want to make it abundantly clear. We're not advocating that you go out there.
I'm going to go run a marathon tomorrow.
Yeah, and immediately jump right. Particularly if you've been inactive for a while. you need to build up a good base of, let's just call it overall tissue health before you jump into the intense aerobic training, because when you start getting into those higher thresholds, there is a greater risk of injury. And anytime that you are injuring yourself, that's a surefire way to put a real damper on any positive movement trends that you have. So we are not advocating against intense aerobic activity, but we are definitely saying that you don't start there. You need to really intentionally build up your activity levels and gradually increase your intensity levels before you start getting into that real full-on effort. Because again, particularly in older populations, the risk of injury for that is not insignificant. And we just need to be careful. Do not avoid it, but move toward it carefully and slowly. That, I think, is what I would say.
That's a very important point. Absolutely. And that point holds true with the next exercise strategy, which is resistance training. You do want to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. Start with body weight, even just moving your body in ways that maybe you're not used to, and then adding on to that. But this is going to boost overall glycemic control. So it's going to just overall keep the glucose levels better across different times, post-meal, pre-meal, before, all of these things, and lowers fasting glucose. And that's really going to reduce the burden on the alpha cells. And again, we're going to just say it again, even though we mentioned it before, walking after meals, even as little as 2 minutes. This is really going to help blunt any spikes that could occur post-meal. And, we've talked about this many, many podcasts. But it's so powerful that these same lifestyle strategies help correct multiple defects that are occurring. So it's simultaneously improving the sensitivity to insulin, the preservation of the beta cells, and also alpha cell regulation.
I think you called it the non-prescription prescription earlier. I really like that. That really is the do this consistently and you get better. I mean, that's the, it's simple, not easy, I think is
simple, but not easy.
Yeah.
One of my favorite
It doesn't have to
sayings.
be complex to work, but it does have to be consistent. You do have to intentionally start making these habits part of your daily life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People have so much more power to change this than they think. And what you said regarding starting somewhere and starting slowly and building up is crucial, because people tend to tweak their knee or tweak their back, and then they believe, and I'm not sure why this is true, I think it's just been perpetuated across society and culture, that rest is the only way to heal it, when in fact too much rest can make these things worse in many instances, when what you really need is to move those knots out of the muscles and get the lymph flowing, get everything going and moving and clearing out. And so get moving, do something, because you've listened to this podcast, and we hope to see you very soon.
Yeah. Talk to you next week. There you have it. One more reminder that type 2 diabetes is not just about too much sugar or not enough insulin. It's a complex, multifactorial, multi-organ hormonal condition that demands more than a prescription pad. But the good news? You have more power than you may think. With the right lifestyle prescription, you can address the root causes and move towards diabetes remission. If you found today's episode helpful, think of a friend who may also find this helpful. We ask you to please leave a review and subscribe to be able to find us more easily in the future. If you would appreciate more support and a faster path to mastery and ready to work with a team that gets results for you, visit empowerdiabetes.com to learn more about how we help people put type 2 diabetes into remission and keep it there for good. Until next time, take courage. You can do this, and we can help.